Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of CIGI's lecture series. Thank you also to those joining us from around the world through our online webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences here at CIGI at the microphones on either side, or if you're watching online through the live chat function on your screen, you can ask questions. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Canada's 12-year military mission in Afghanistan officially came to an end this past week as the flag came down in Kabul. But the political debate over its effectiveness continues. As many Canadians are left wondering, was it worth it? We have here to address the most important questions tonight about Afghanistan, the former ambassador of Afghanistan to Canada, Omar Samad. He will discuss the prospects for continued advancement and independence, and whether Afghanistan is in transition or stalemate. And following tonight's address, our featured speaker will be joined in discussion on stage by Finn Osler-Hampson, who is a CIGI Distinguished Fellow and Director of CIGI's Research Program in Global Security and Politics. Finn will also help to moderate the question and answers. In addition to being the former ambassador of Afghanistan to Canada from 2004 to 2009, Omar Samad also served as ambassador of Afghanistan to France from 2009 to 2011. He's currently a senior Central Asia Fellow at the New America Foundation and the founder and president of Silk Road Consulting based in Virginia. He's an advocate for freedom and democracy in Afghanistan and is involved in a number of organizations and initiatives that focus on the advancement of human rights and education. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Ambassador Omar Samad.
Good evening. Thank you very much, and thank you for this kind invitation for me to leave a very cold and snowy Washington and come to this beautiful, sunny Waterloo. I told my wife earlier that it's sunny and warm and springy here, and she was very jealous. But I have been to Waterloo before. When on duty in Ottawa, I was invited on several occasions. But never in this room. So every time I spoke, I guess it was in a different building, but the crowd was also always very attentive and very warm, and I look forward to your questions. I'm here today as just an Afghan who now has left the Afghan government after 10 years of service, and somewhat displeased by the turn of events after the 2009 elections, and decided to go to the United States, but continue to work on Afghanistan and the region. So my focus has been, for the past 30-something years, has been Afghanistan ever since the communists and the Soviets came to that country. And so I have viewed and experienced and been a witness to many events that country, my country, has undergone over the last 30-something years, since 1978 actually. And I think it's always very important to spend just a few minutes, and I know that our main topic today is about what is happening currently in the transition that Afghanistan is undergoing right now, what the international community may or may not be doing, what Afghanistan faces as elections come up, and as NATO and US forces leave by the end of 2014, what the Taliban are doing, and how the region looks like, and so on and so forth. But I think it's very important for us to take 5 minutes and discuss this historic backdrop, to remind all of us of where we've come, where this country has come from, what it has undergone. Very briefly, as you all know by now, since Afghanistan has been on people's mind for the past decade or more, Afghanistan used to be a very stable, peaceful country prior to 1978. I remember it as a young man growing up in Afghanistan. and so did my father's generation and my grandfather's generation. There's always this notion that Afghanistan has always been a country at war with itself, tribal warfare, warlords, so on and so forth. That is not the case at all. It's in '78 that the communist coup took place. The Soviets invaded in '79, and basically that was the start of very severe turmoil in Afghanistan, a turmoil that continues to haunt that country and its people. The Soviet occupation lasted 10 years, destroyed most of Afghanistan. So the destruction that most of us saw after 2001, especially rural Afghanistan, was as a result of the Soviet occupation, displacement of more than 6 million Afghans, mostly to neighboring countries, about 2 or 3 million of whom are still in neighboring countries, and the rest have returned to Afghanistan over the last decade. Probably the loss of more than 1 million Afghans, and I'm being very conservative in my numbers, and the destruction of every type of institution and infrastructure that had been built over a couple of generations. The Soviet occupation did not bring anything good to Afghanistan, unfortunately, even though they occupied major cities and were preoccupied with indoctrinating the young Afghans. But the Afghan people fought valiantly, and eventually, with the help of Western, covert assistance to Afghan fighters, the Soviets finally left. But while the Soviets were in Afghanistan, a couple of things happened that were of notable importance and relate to today's events. One, the Afghans fighting the Soviets had to organize themselves out of Pakistan, our eastern southern neighbor, and out of Iran, our western neighbor. And those two countries gained a very strong level of influence over Afghan affairs as a result of hosting millions of Afghans and allowing them to organize themselves in the Soviet war. And this influence continues to this day. One of the side effects of this influence was the imbalanced assistance that Pakistan's rulers, military rulers, provided to extremist groups and Afghan extremist groups fighting the Soviets. There were all kinds of different groups fighting the Soviets, but the more radical groups received the bulk of the assistance coming from the West and other countries to help them fight the Soviets. And this is where we see the beginnings of the growth of this type of radicalism in the region, and eventually by the mid-1990s, the emergence of a group called the Taliban. The second thing that happened was that as soon as the Soviets left in 1989, the West and others who had been helping the Afghans from a humanitarian point of view, as well as supplying them with weapons to fight the Soviets, left this mission prematurely. And Afghanistan was left in a vacuum with no political settlement, no new government emerging, no constitutions being drafted, no elections being taking place. And the country fell into the hands of ragtag militias, warlords, and later Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And so, having left Afghanistan with no institutions or political system in place, turned out to be very costly. And throughout the 1990s, Afghanistan suffered as a result of civil war, and then the occupation of Afghanistan by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I don't want to go too much into the details of how the Taliban emerged, but basically they are a religious militia who have the support of radical groups in our region and beyond. And to this day, they have been able to have sanctuaries and bases outside of the country without which they would have a very hard time surviving in Afghanistan because of a lack of popular support. Every survey that has been taken over the last few years shows that the Taliban have no more than 7 to 10% at best of popular support in certain parts of Afghanistan, which is an indication that the Afghan people reject them as a political military force and see them as a force that has been imposed on Afghanistan. And then we had the Taliban period, which was a very dark period where women and girls suffered the most, and men as well. There was no economy, no system of governance, nothing. And Afghanistan became a hub for terrorism, international terrorism, and Al-Qaeda joined the Taliban and used Afghanistan as a staging ground for attacks on other countries. And we know what happened with 9/11 and many other events, such as 9/11, prior to 9/11 and after 9/11. So this is when the international community turned its attention back to Afghanistan and realized that this was a job that was unfinished and incomplete. And we need to go back and fix this country and give it back to its people. Fixing doesn't mean that you come and stay and do everything that the people of that country needs to do. It means creating a political structure that can be sustainable, reviving the economy, reviving institutions, and giving people back, having an army and a police, a judicial system, and so on and so forth, everything that a country needs in terms of state building. And so this project of state building in Afghanistan has reached a point where now the army and the police, comprised of more than 350,000 forces, and it has been trained and it has been equipped by NATO and many other countries, including Canada. And there is a functioning civil administration, especially in the cities, but it has its weaknesses, and it's also facing a challenge with corruption. So the country, if people always try to ask, so have we done well? Is Afghanistan failing? Was this all a waste of time and energy and lives and money? And my answer, and I think the answer of many Afghans who have dealt with this issue and are dealing with it, is that it's a very mixed picture. It's a mixed bag of accomplishments in failures, of gains, as well as some setbacks, and some very precise and concrete challenges that exist. On the security front, with the Taliban still trying to disrupt life for everyone, with a government that now is leaving and is a country that is going through political transition in the form of an election coming up over the next few days on April 5th, in a transition from a Karzai era to a new era, and through elections, in a country that is living in a region of the world that is still very troubled. I mean, I don't have to show you, but if you look on a map, you see that we are surrounded by some very unique hotspots and a very dangerous neighborhood in the world. Pakistan on one side with all its issues dealing with extremism and sectarian warfare. Iran with its issues domestically as well as with the international community on the nuclear file. Central Asia, these collections of former Soviet republics, Central Asian republics that are on the brink of a generational transformation and transition themselves, and nobody really knows what might happen in Central Asia. And even China, and some of you may have followed the news and realized that there is more and more attempts by Chinese Uyghur minority groups who hail from the western part of China at the borders of Pakistan and Afghanistan, who are creating a sense of insecurity in parts of China because some of their militant groups have been able to get training in other countries such as Pakistan. And so the Uyghurs of China are seen as a threat to the Chinese government. So the region overall has issues, and I'm not going to go into the Middle East, which is further away, but the problem of Al-Qaeda, as we knew it after 9/11, seems to not have disappeared, unfortunately. For a while, we thought that with the killing of Osama bin Laden, that Al-Qaeda was no more. Today, we realize that Al-Qaeda is still around and has been decentralized and is fractured into smaller units. And they are now in existence and very much in operational mode in countries stretching from Yemen to Syria and from Iraq to certain parts of Africa. So the threat posed by the Al-Qaeda as we knew it back in the early days of this century has not gone away, unfortunately. And they even announced a few days ago that they are planning to make a comeback in Afghanistan once the Americans leave. So with this kind of situation and this kind of historic backdrop, Afghanistan has benefited, in my opinion, from 13 years of international engagement. This international engagement has been in the form of a very large multilateral participation of many countries, not only to help build institutions, especially security institutions, but also to train Afghans and to mentor Afghans and to help them create civil administration and civil society, to give women a voice, to help us with education and healthcare. And all of this has been done partly with your assistance, your tax dollars, and many other countries' tax dollars over the last 13 years. So in the opinion of many Afghans, this glass is half full and not half empty. And the situation in Afghanistan is somewhat irreversible in terms of thinking that the Taliban overnight can come back and take over and take control of all the country. And the main reason is that the Afghan population, a population that today is about 70% under the age of 30 and who have been exposed over the last 13 years to the changes that Afghanistan has undergone, changes that include a very strong penetration of internet and high technologies in Afghan lives, where today you have more than 10 million cell phones, you have internet in parts of Afghanistan that never had it before. You have today, you have more than 8 million kids going to school, and you have hundreds of thousands of young men and women going to colleges and universities, whereas 13 years ago you only had a few boys going to school, and that is it. You have access to healthcare, even though it's not very good and it's not the best, but infant mortality has been brought down tremendously. The health situation of women in maternal health care has been boosted, and the living standards of Afghans has increased. The per capita income has quadrupled over the last 13 years. And these are things that, we can go on with these statistics. These are things that are real, and these are things that have made a difference in people's lives, and these are things that everyone can be proud of. So whatever in Afghanistan, we always hear very bad news and negative news, but there's a lot of good news, and the good news itself comes from the Afghan people itself. And so this is why I think that they are very eager, on one hand, to deal with elections and to go ahead with elections, and they hope that these elections will be as fair, as just, and as transparent as possible, that there will not be any meddling by anyone, any side, domestic or otherwise, in the election process, that security will be maintained during elections on April 5th, that A large number of Afghans will be able to go to the polling stations and vote, including women. And so these are all the hopes, and that they will see change and a new leadership emerge in Afghanistan that will tackle these problems that exist, from corruption to the insurgency to regional relations and to our relations with the West. Now, I want to spend a minute or so talking about our relations with the West. When we talk about the West, of course, we're talking about many countries, but I'm going to focus on partly the US and also Canada. The US and Afghanistan have had this odd relationship over the past year or two, ever since President Karzai decided to play hardball with the Americans and to express his dissatisfaction with the results of certain initiatives, especially in regards to bringing peace to Afghanistan and to approaching the Taliban for a peace deal. He blames the Americans, saying that the Americans haven't done enough and the Americans can do more, on one hand, to go after the real source of problems, not inside Afghanistan, but outside our borders, especially he's referring to Pakistan, where the sanctuaries exist. And number two, that the Americans hold some cards in terms of releasing certain Taliban from Guantanamo, or pushing the Pakistanis to push the Taliban to come to the negotiating table. It's a very complex situation, but he has been unhappy with the Americans, and the Americans have been unhappy with him, and the Afghan people have been unhappy mostly with Mr. Karzai's administration since the 2009 presidential elections, when it was alleged that major fraud was committed in that election. And so this is why people are extremely sensitive to the fact that they do not want to see a repeat of 2009 in a couple of weeks when they go to the polls. But Karzai's era is ending, even though he may have a very, a horse running right now, and he may have a hand-picked candidate, a preferred candidate running. But whether he wins or not, the Afghan people, I think, would like to see a new chapter open. And they have expressed their desire to have a good relations with the United States and Western countries in general. Every survey, every gathering, from parliament to the Afghan traditional jirga, have expressed the desire to have a security agreement signed with the United States that would allow for US troops numbering between 8,000 to 10,000 to stay in Afghanistan beyond 2014, when this current mission ends. And for the Americans and others to continue to train, and NATO to continue to train Afghan forces and supply them with equipment and munitions and arms that they need to fight the Taliban. That particular document has not been signed yet by President Karzai, who is holding off for personal and political reasons. But it is assumed that anyone else replacing him after elections will sign it, and every candidate running has indicated that they will sign this document with the Americans. It's not just a question of security, it's also a question of billions of dollars of aid to Afghanistan over the next few years. There have been commitments made over the last 2-3 years to Afghanistan in the tune of $4 to $5 billion a year of aid. Afghanistan's revenues have increased sharply over the last few years, but they are nowhere near the needs that the country has in terms of even paying the salaries of its soldiers. So as Afghanistan looks forward to one day increasing its revenues through mining and agriculture and other sectors, right now it is facing a dilemma because it does not generate enough revenue to run a government. And so foreign assistance, as promised by the international community, is going to be critical, and that assistance is somewhat beholden to this security agreement being signed with the Americans and with NATO. So this is where we stand in terms of the relationship with Washington. A few words about Canada. As was mentioned earlier, I served here as ambassador from 2004 to 2009, a very unique period in Canadian-Afghan relations, but especially in terms of Canada's role in Afghanistan. I, as an Afghan, have always expressed my gratitude for what Canada stood for and what Canada did until just a few days ago to help Afghanistan. It meant that Canadian leaders, whether they were from one party or the other, understood where Afghanistan came from, what had happened to Afghanistan, and what needed to be done collectively with other countries to help put this country back on its feet. Regardless of what the debate was here in Canada, political and social and otherwise, the Afghan people know of your sacrifices, and they are grateful for the Canadian engagement and the Canadian assistance, and I think they value it very much from what I know of my people and of our mindset towards those who have helped us in times of need. I also think that the Canadian mission did its best, and the Canadians, both in uniform and civilians, did the best they could under the circumstances that existed, whether in Kandahar or in Kabul before that, or in Kabul after Kandahar. Kandahar was the toughest province of Afghanistan for a variety of reasons, and some have written about it and some have addressed these reasons, maybe not in its entirety, but for a set of reasons, Canada ended up in Kandahar. Canada could have ended up in another province of Afghanistan, and things could have been very different. But Kandahar was the most difficult province. And so I think Canadians have to be very proud of what your sons and daughters did, and to cherish the memories of those who were lost, and to know that you did make a difference in Kandahar and beyond. You had promised to, for example, build an important dam. You may have not completed it, but you started it, and now it's being worked on, and one day it will be completed. You promised to build schools and send tens of thousands of boys and girls to school in Kandahar, and you did, and tens of thousands of boys and girls are going to school, and who knows, maybe one of them will end up being the president of Afghanistan. You promised to fight against certain diseases like polio and so on and so forth, and you did the best that was possible under the circumstances. And then Canada did much more than that. I know for a fact that millions of your dollars were spent in training Afghans, in raising capacities, in education, in healthcare, in human rights, in gender rights, in democracy development and building, in civil society building, and in media, and in many other areas in Afghanistan, much of which you do not know, nobody talks about, because they are just items in a report that the media does not pick up, or that politicians do not talk about. But the impact in Afghanistan has been great, and the impact on the Afghan population and society will not go away anytime soon. So my message is, do not be swayed by negativity or cynicism. Canada should be proud of what it did. It was a unique experience. And what you also did was stand shoulder to shoulder with your allies. It would have been very odd if everybody else went to Afghanistan and Canada did not go to Afghanistan. So you proved yourselves to all of your NATO allies and other friends that you have alliances with. So that is how it's seen from an Afghan perspective. My hope is, as someone who lived in your country for almost 5 winters, that and survived. I did experience, coming from a very cold country like Afghanistan with mountains and snow, I did experience the harshest winter in Ottawa during my tenure. So that is reality. But my hope is that Canada will find a new civilian mission to pursue in Afghanistan from here on. I know that there are commitments on the civilian side to help Afghans, but I hope that the linkages that have, just imagine, tens of thousands of your citizens served in Afghanistan. And I am sure that if you ask most of them, they would probably say yes, it was worth it, yes, we are proud of it, and yes, we should continue to do something. I'm not saying you should go and fight. I'm saying there's a lot more that can be done, and I hope that your government and your representatives will focus on that at a time when there are so many other crises around the world, and continue these linkages with Afghanistan that actually link tens of thousands of people across these continents. In the next 5 to 10 minutes that I have, I want to talk to you a little bit about these elections that are coming up. These elections are absolutely critical to Afghans. I already mentioned a few things about it, but I want to go in a bit of more detail. These elections are going to either provide Afghanistan with a chance to break with the last 13 years, acknowledge and appreciate the achievements of the last 13 years, and focus on the failures of the last 13 years and correct the course for the next few years. I think that the Afghan people are looking for better leadership. I think the Afghan people are looking for better governance, rule of law, a respect of human rights and gender rights, fight against corruption, fight against narcotics and the opium trade that has flourished and has not been dealt with, and eventually the fight against the daily threat of Taliban and extremists who want to disrupt normalcy in Afghanistan and want to turn Afghanistan once again into a terrorist hub. These elections are going to take place in a few days. There are currently 9 remaining candidates on the roster, 3 of whom seem to be the front runners, the ones with stronger support in the population. 2 or 3 polls have been taken over the last few weeks, and they show 2 of the 3 to be in the 30% to 35% range support, and they show the third one being less than that in the 15 to 20% support range, and the rest are much lower. As I mentioned earlier, one of these candidates is supported covertly and not overtly by President Karzai, who seems to favor one of these individuals, and the other 2 are much more independent and all are well-known Afghans who used to be ministers and political leaders. No one knows what is going to happen, but the future of this, the future of the international community's engagement in Afghanistan is very much going to also rest on the results of these elections. If these elections are fraudulent and not acceptable and not credible enough and not legitimate enough, then I think that the country may slip into a political crisis mode. And that means that all projects will be put will be halted. And the international community is going to have a very different look at Afghanistan and not be able to make good on its commitments. But if these elections are not perfect, and nobody is expecting perfection from these elections, but if these elections are credible enough and accepted by the large majority of Afghans and the large constituencies that exist in the country, then I think that it's safe enough to say that the international community is also going to go along with it, and they're going to make good on their commitments, both in terms of security assistance and future aid commitments to Afghanistan. We will see in a few days what exactly happens, because a lot rides on this. Another issue that very much is impacted by elections is this whole notion of political peace and political outreach to the Taliban. For the past 4 or 5 years, there has been an attempt at trying to encourage the Taliban to lay down their arms, stop fighting, stop destroying, stop killing, and joining the rest of Afghanistan, and coming from their sanctuaries in Pakistan with their families, returning to Afghanistan, and maybe even taking part in government. Running, everyone urged them to run in the elections. But they have been very clear. They have issued statements saying, their leadership saying that not only do they not believe in elections or this democratic process, but that they will continue to disrupt it and they will continue to destroy it. And there's evidence on a daily basis that there are attacks in different parts of Afghanistan by the Taliban or groups affiliated with the Taliban who want to disrupt the process. So one of the reasons why this is happening is because this reconciliation process has not resulted in any change. And this happened after President Obama announced, if you remember, in 2009, the surge, which was followed by a sudden stop of the surge, and then an announcement that NATO and the US will pull out by 2014. What it did was convey this message to the Taliban that all they have to do is wait till 2014 and continue their activities. And once the US and NATO leaves, then they can obviously have a freer hand, and pursue their objectives in any way that they choose, without having the Western security obstacles in front of them. But now what they're realizing is that the Western security obstacles are being replaced by Afghan security obstacles. And this army and police of 350,000 men and women is strong enough and dedicated enough to make a stand against the Taliban. And I think this is an opportunity for the new government in Kabul, the new government that will emerge in Kabul over the next few weeks, to show strength and to engage the Taliban from a position of strength. The problem in the past has been that the Taliban have been engaged from a position of weakness. And they have not been interested in dealing with Mr. Karzai, and the hope in Afghanistan is that eventually they will deal with the next leader of the country. But there's one very important element in all of this, and that is the role played by Pakistan. Pakistan is the country where the Taliban and their families reside. And Pakistan is the country that everyone knows has all the sanctuaries and the bases out of which the Taliban operate. So everyone in Afghanistan, and I think in the international community, are watching very closely how Pakistan is going to handle the situation of the Taliban on its soil. It has a problem with its own Taliban and is trying to reach out to them, but no one knows whether there will be any result with the Pakistani Taliban. And there is some hope that eventually the Pakistani leadership, both military and civilian, will realize that there is no good Taliban and bad Taliban, that there's just Taliban, and you need to deal with both of them. Because so far, the Afghan Taliban have been considered as sort of good in the eyes of Pakistan because they serve a purpose for them, a strategic purpose, and their own Taliban, their own brand of Taliban, have been considered as bad. And so now, there's a new realization that maybe at the end of the day, they're all the same. And if we want to save this region from Talibanization and extremism and other terrorists coming and joining them, then we need to take a stand. So there is hope on that front. There's hope that Pakistan will play a different game now, that it will be more sincere, and that it will do everything possible to allow for a just Afghan peace deal to happen. That is one major issue that has been dealt with. The last thing I want to tell you is something positive about Afghan society. I mentioned earlier that a lot has changed. The greatest hope of Afghanistan is its youth. With 70% under the age of 30, as I said, with access to the internet and tweeting every day and following the elections through Facebook, and if you watch one of the 50 or so private TV channels in Afghanistan, or listen to one of the 130 radio stations, or read one of the 300 newspapers, publications today, something that did not exist 10 years ago or 12 years ago, you realize that this country has changed drastically, and that it's real, and that the Afghans are very much committed to making sure that they do not go backwards, and that they will continue to go forward. And I will end on that, and I hope that we'll have time for discussions on many other subjects. Thanks.
Sit here. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for those very eloquent remarks. And I'd like to begin our conversation by referring to a television show that many of the people in this audience would have seen last week on the withdrawal of Canadian troops from Afghanistan. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in one of its nightly segments, interviewed the sons and daughters of 3 servicemen who had given their lives in Afghanistan. And I don't know how many of you in the audience saw that segment, but it really was very poignant. These young women and men, and they were young, they were teenagers, were clearly very proud of what their parents had done in giving their lives in your country. But at the same time, they were angry. and they were angry because they felt that their fathers had died in vain. What would you say to them if you had the opportunity to have them here?
It's never easy, is it? I would obviously, I don't think there are any words that one can say to try to give them an answer. But if I had the means and the possibility, I would actually take them to Afghanistan. I would show them images of what used to be and images of what is now. I would have them talk to people anywhere they want, any city, any village, any part of the country, to have a face-to-face with ordinary Afghans, people of their age, and people of any category, and ask them if this was worth it or not. And I think they will give them the answer. I can spend hours, as any other Afghan, telling you what is worth, what has been worth it and what has not, but nothing could replace reality on the ground. And so that's what I would probably do. And as I tried to give you that picture, and I think that if you ask Canadians who have been to Afghanistan, who have worked in Afghanistan, who have served in Afghanistan, and have been there on more than one occasion, for example, they would probably attest to the fact that, yes, there has been very significant change from day one to now.
Ambassador, you spoke very eloquently about Canada's contribution, not just the military contribution, but our development assistance contribution and our diplomacy. Looking back, and this may be a somewhat unfair question, but we would welcome your views, what did we do particularly well, and what did we do badly? And the reason I ask that question is that in the past week, many of our commentators have been writing about lessons of Afghanistan. And as you pointed out, and some of them have pointed out, Afghanistan, on balance, is a much better and much happier place today than it was in 2001.
Yes.
But, and I think that's a very important message to convey. But Canadians like to be self-critical, and we would welcome your views as to what we did well and what we did poorly.
First, I would say don't be too self-critical. I know Canadians are humble and generous and self-critical to some extent, but you did well first in the military mission. As I said, you ended up in the most difficult corner of Afghanistan. And it could have been worse. It could have been much worse. But I think that your fighting forces and your soldiers did an amazing job with the task that they were given. Then the other very significant, valuable part of the Canadian mission was training. I think that you have proved yourself in training and mentoring, and Afghans respect that very much. And the third thing is that you have always stood for principles. You've stood for values. You've stood for things such as human rights and human rights training, gender training, equality issues in the Afghan system, from the military to the civilian side, for rule of law, for a better justice system, You've done work, you've invested in that, and you've spent money on all those sectors. So those are the areas that I think will always be remembered as, with the Canadian flag on it. Then I think that you missed an opportunity to leave behind a couple of Canadian, tangible Canadian infrastructure projects. Mm-hmm. You tried to build the Dala Dam, and you did a fairly good job given the circumstances on the ground and the politics on the ground. And it's going to be continued. So you started it, and maybe we will finish it, or somebody else will help us finish it. But I would have, when I was in Ottawa, you always used to tell your ministers and your leaders that you're spending a huge amount of money. Afghanistan is the #1 aid recipient, and historically the largest recipient of aid of Canada, historically. And you need to really see that in a country like Afghanistan, aside from trying to build up XYZ, you also need to do some work on infrastructure and leave behind maybe certain projects that can always be seen as the Canadian project, whether electricity, whether it's a road, even though some road work was done, whether it's even a hospital in Kandahar. And so once you compare the billions of dollars that were spent to the sort of very weak, tangible infrastructure that was left behind, you wonder why that happened. There was an opportunity, but it's not the end of the road. I think that hopefully in the future, with more stability in the country, that could be done.
One of the things that is obviously going to be critical to Afghanistan's future is the state and health of the economy. And that was something you didn't talk about, but let me ask you, what is happening economically? Afghanistan, as some of the members of our audience may know, is a country that is rich in natural resources. You have apparently one of the largest iron ore deposits in the world. It's owned by China. China hasn't chosen as yet to develop it. It's a country that has huge potential. Now, as a result of development assistance, a population whose educational levels of attainment are growing. But from an economic standpoint, what is the health of the economy? Why should foreigners invest in Afghanistan? And how do you see the economy going forward?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I did not dwell with that because of the time issue, but I expected your question. So I think that the economy from 2002 up until last year had double-digit growth every year. One of the very few economies in that part of the world with that kind of growth. But that is because we started basically at the baseline. And so when you start at the baseline, the growth rate is much higher and faster. Investment has come into Afghanistan, but the iron ore actually ended up in the hands of Indian companies. And if I'm not mistaken, there is a Canadian also component to the investment in iron ore. The copper mines of Afghanistan ended up with the Chinese. But Afghanistan, this is the tip of the iceberg. Afghanistan has much more to offer in terms of investment in the mineral sector, including rare earth material, one of the largest in the world. Everything is untapped. Everything is underground. And there are two reasons for that. One is the whole security situation over the last decades. And the other has to do with the new legal and professional frameworks that have to be developed. And you know very well, because you're a very rich country in terms of minerals and natural resources, that you also need the infrastructure in place to be able to effectively exploit it. And you have to have the legal frameworks in place to make sure that it doesn't turn out as it did in some countries in Africa and other places, where it not only was not a bonanza, but it became a source of conflict and crisis. We do not want to have these trillions of dollars worth of, basically the US Geological Survey shows that Afghanistan has between $1 to $3 trillion worth of minerals, which is huge, and including oil and gas. And so we were hoping that with good governance, the right legal framework, with the right rule of law, security, we can then start inviting other investors to come in. And I hope that one day Canadian firms will be able to come and join. Now, the other part of Afghanistan's economy rests on agriculture. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is 80% of Afghanistan is made up of farmers, some of whom, unfortunately, are dealing in, have been dealing in poppy cultivation. Poppy cultivation is not a traditional, poppy is not a traditional crop in Afghanistan, meaning that it became a necessity during the Soviet occupation. Farmers who lost their land or farmers whose lands were destroyed had to resort to quick income-generating solutions. And this is when poppy really became widespread. Before that, before the 1970s, Afghanistan had very, very small amounts of poppy production. And it was cotton mainly, wheat, and other crops. So this has been the crop of war. This is the war crop. and Afghan farmers have benefited to some extent. The major part of the narcotics trade and business is in the hands of international mafias. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, you know very well, if there is no demand, if there is no market for anything in the world, there will not be a supply. So you also have to deal with the demand side of heroin and morphine and other, you know, and I'm talking about the illicit part of it. And then there's, of course, the illicit part of it in terms of pharmaceuticals, which I hope one day can benefit Afghanistan, because right now with the security situation, it's impossible to take that route. So the economy overall has done well. You know, income, per capita income has increased. Revenues have increased. There's some stability in the monetary and fiscal side of the economy, but it is a very aid-dependent country. And Afghans understand this. And this is why post-2014, if Afghanistan fails to receive the commitments made at the Tokyo conference 2 years ago, and in Chicago almost a year and a half ago, it will face major crises.
You mentioned, and this will be my last question before we turn to the audience, so please start thinking about your questions and come up to the mics here. But you mentioned the importance of the continuing American security guarantee going forward, some 6,000 to 10,000 troops. As we all know, the relationship between President Karzai and the Obama administration has been a very rocky one. And sour would be putting it kindly. Among the likely leadership contenders Do you see that relationship improving, or do you see the Karzai legacy hanging over the bilateral relationship between Afghanistan and the United States?
I think that every one of the candidates has indicated publicly on the record that they will sign the agreement once elected. I also believe that even President Karzai's favorite candidate is going to sign it, and Karzai just did not want, for a variety of reasons, did not want to be the one signing it. One of those reasons is that he came, in 2001, he came as a result of an international effort and an Afghan effort. He was selected, not elected, he was selected at a conference as the interim leader. And he feels that he wants to leave office as a sovereign leader. And he feels that if he signs this document, it would take away from that stature of sovereignty that he wants to leave as a legacy. And he wants to also leave as a nationalist who stood up to the Americans, while for 12 years he was called the American puppet. And he wants to wash away that brand. On the other hand, he also is playing politics with this. It's the only leverage he has left with the Americans and within Afghan political circles. And so he wants to maintain this leverage to the extent possible and as long as possible, and not become a lame duck president earlier than needed.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to invite those of you who have questions to please come up to the microphone. As our host, Vice President Kuntz, asked you to do earlier, please state your name and say from whence you come. This lady over here on my left.
Thank you, Mr. Samad, for your presentation. And there are some people who say that the image and narrative about Afghan women were misused, and it was not so much about helping women, but more to rally support behind the military intervention, because showing women faces suffering and children gives more public support. So what is your opinion about how the image of Afghan women was presented and the narrative about them was framed, be it by Western governments or even by NGOs within the military intervention context?
No. I think that one of the most striking achievements of the last 13 years has been gender rights, in the area of gender rights and with women empowerment, and giving Afghan women at least their basic rights, not only in the constitution of Afghanistan, but also in practice. I say this to you because Afghan women have probably suffered more than any other segment of society over the last 35 years. And they suffered even more under the 6-year-long rule of the Taliban prior to 2001. Everybody knows what the Taliban rules and laws and edicts were in regards to women and girls. And it was a travesty. It was something that had never happened in Afghanistan, and nobody had ever treated women in such manner. Not saying that Afghanistan has a very good, record of treatment of women or minorities or anything, but I'm saying that what the Taliban did was the worst of the worst. And since then, again, you cannot compare the situation of women today to 2001. The role of women in society has changed completely. They feel empowered at some level. I'm not saying all levels, but at some level. It's work in progress. It's going to take many more years to reach levels such as, countries that are in the mid-section of development. I don't want to compare the situation of Afghan women to Scandinavian women or Canadian women because they come from two very different historic and social backgrounds. But today I can give you, again, statistic over statistics, from 68 women in the Afghan parliament to tens of thousands of young women studying in universities and colleges, to 40% of 60% of the teachers in Afghanistan are women, and 30% of civil servants in Afghanistan are women today. Whereas 2001, there was not a single civil servant. We have women governors, we have women ministers, we have women ambassadors. So there has been a lot achieved, but there's much more that needs to be done, especially in regards to violence against women. And I hope that in the future we can address all of that, all of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. This microphone over here, the gentleman standing there.
My name is Brian Finlayson. I'm from Kitchener. Ambassador, could you comment on the Soviet strategic interests that led them to be involved in Afghanistan in the first place, that led to the Western response, and also if those strategic interests have changed?
Soviet or
Sorry?
Russian.
The Russians. Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, for almost 7 decades, had cordial relations. In the 1950s, the then Afghan government decided to modernize its military. It first went to Washington and said, would you like to train and equip our military? And the Americans, for a variety of reasons that had to do with the 1950s geopolitics of the times, because Pakistan and Iran were already very close to Washington, decided that Afghanistan really didn't matter that much and said, no, thank you. When they did so, the Afghan government turned to the Soviets and said, would you like to help us modernize? And the Soviets were extremely happy to receive this demand and request, and they accepted, and they said, send us thousands of your young men mostly for training. We will educate them. We'll give you $100 million credit line to buy the type of equipment that you would like, including build up an air force, and so on and so forth. And so since then, until 1978, before the communist coup, Afghanistan had cordial, good relations, but was not part of the Warsaw Pact. It was a non-aligned country. It was reliant on the Soviets for its military. That reliance caused the coup, because some of those young Afghans who went to the Soviets for training and education were also indoctrinated in the Soviet system, and they came back and joined an underground pro-Moscow Communist Party. And that party, with very strong roots in the Afghan army and air force, staged the 1978 coup and called it a revolution, which it wasn't, it was just a military coup, and turned Afghanistan towards the Soviets. And then by 79, the Soviet Union invaded, because as soon as the coup occurred, people across Afghanistan picked up arms and saw a Soviet attempt at taking over their country, and saw the communists as imposed by the Soviet Union, and saw the Soviet Union as an atheist foreign force that was trying to impose itself on Afghanistan. And so this became a popular rebellion against that government. And before the government could collapse, was about to collapse, the Soviets invaded to save it from collapse. And that was the beginning of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan that lasted for 10 years. And so I told you a little bit about how then the Afghans were organized in fighting the Soviets. But does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I think we'll go to one of our podcast viewers. The question, if I can read it out for the audience, I think they'll also put it up here. Are there examples of nations who have promised to stay longer to support Afghanistan's public sector, particularly in areas of health or education?
Yeah.
And that's Will Postma.
Right. Well, the commitments made, as I mentioned earlier, at a conference that was held 2 years ago in Tokyo on future commitments to Afghanistan involved over 60 countries, including Canada. And every one of those countries, donors, committed to helping Afghanistan in one or another, in different sectors, including health and education. And the total amount of commitment made to Afghanistan at this international gathering was in the tune of about $4.5 billion per year for the next 4 or 5 years. So if countries, it's one thing for a country to pledge, and it's another thing for a country to then make good on its commitment and disperse that money that will then be transferred to the recipient country. So I hope that as a result of the commitments made in Tokyo, that there will be countries that will continue to help Afghanistan in the health and education sector.
That's a good research project for some of the students who are in the audience. You might even get it reported in the newspapers if you wrote about that. This gentleman over here by the mic. Or, I'm sorry, lady by the mic?
Yeah,
My apologies.
Me?
Yes,
Okay.
you.
Question in your name.
Sorry.
My name is Jane Annandale. I'm a military mom, so I've followed this topic very closely. I understand that when the Taliban came into Afghanistan, there was a lot of destruction of people's homes, businesses, infrastructure, and so on. To what extent is that being rebuilt?
Ma'am, the destruction that took place in Afghanistan occurred over a very long period of time. It started in 1978, and the studies that have been made show that almost 80% of Afghan rural life was destroyed under the Soviet occupation. I mean, the Soviets had two ways of trying to fight this war. One was by dropping mines across Afghanistan. To this day, we have still, after we've cleaned up millions of square meters of mines, we still have an estimated 3 to 4 million mines scattered around Afghanistan. They could be anywhere, and people, children, women, walk on them on a daily basis or blown up on a daily basis. That was inherited by the Soviets, from the Soviets. The other tactic used by the Soviets was carpet bombing. And so this destroyed a lot of agricultural land and villages and so on and so forth. Then there was destruction that took place mostly in and around Kabul during the 1992 to 1996 period because of factional warfare between different factions affiliated with neighboring countries, some of which were affiliated with neighboring countries, who fought over control of Kabul. Then in 1996, the Taliban who had emerged earlier in southern Afghanistan and had been adopted by the Pakistani military and were supported by radical groups across the Islamic world, emerged and were able to overrun other forces and take hold of Kabul. So there was a lot of fighting around, in and around Kabul, the destroyed part of Kabul. Since then, there has been little destruction, with the exception of Taliban attacks on certain installations in certain areas. Taliban attacks are usually in the form of IEDs, the improvised devices, explosive devices that they put under earth, and most of your soldiers, unfortunately, have died as a result of IEDs. And suicide bombings, and assassinations. These are the three tactics used by the Taliban. Thank you.
Your turn now.
My name is Mamoon. I'm a resident of Waterloo. My question is kind of related to what the lady asked, and it's more about destruction as well. It's true that Soviets committed atrocities, Taliban committed atrocities, but you did not mention atrocities committed by the Canadian forces, American forces, and international security forces. There were over 40,000 civilian casualties. During 2001-2002, I worked with Human Rights Watch in Afghanistan and Pakistan area, and you mentioned carpet bombing, and we interviewed lots of civilians in the hospitals who mentioned same examples. Now, if I may ask you another unfair question, as the presenter mentioned, just trying to turn the tables around. There have been multiple bombings at weddings, civilian buses, funerals, night raids, and sometimes even civilian casualties or killings by international forces for fun. One example is the kill team. So the question is, I'll just give a real example. A few months ago, a family in Kandahar, Rozi Khan, his family was bombed by the international forces. He lost 12 members of his families. What would you tell Rozi Khan that if he asks you that I tell the international security forces to get out because they murdered me, and here you come and you tell that Canadian forces did a great job, so don't be too much self-critical.
Sure,
Thank you.
I can answer you. I mean, you're I think, mixing up two different set of missions. Okay, the Canadian mission is not to go and kill Afghans. The NATO mission, the international, the ISAF mission that has the endorsement of the United Nations Security Council every year, and they endorsed it again yesterday for the UN, under the UN auspices, to be in Afghanistan, is not a mission to kill Afghans. It's not a mission to go and destroy Afghan homes. In war, mistakes have been made, sometimes blatant mistakes, sometimes inexcusable mistakes. But if you tell me that the Taliban aim is not to kill and destroy, and that the others are there to kill and destroy, or that they are equal, and that their purpose and their aim is equal, then obviously you and I have a very different reading of what is happening in Afghanistan. You work for Human Rights Watch. You need to go and read the latest Human Rights Watch reports and the latest UN report, not ISAF, not NATO, not US, UN reports. And they are very clear that 85 to 90% of civilian casualties every year in Afghanistan has been committed at the hands of the Taliban. That 12% was committed at the hands of Afghan forces, and that the rest was committed at the hands of international forces. Nobody is saying that international forces have not committed atrocities or killed whole families. Nobody's denying that. But was it done as part of a deliberate attempt and plan and objective, or was it done as, inadvertently? Was it done because there was a Talib in that house who had occupied that house that also was holding a family hostage? So, if you go into the details of every event and every incident, you realize that, unfortunately, in conflict, these things do happen. They have happened in every conflict in the world. Look at World War II, look at World War I, look at Korea, look at any war. But to come and say that I should not be saying that the Canadian troops performed honorably is not going to make a case. It's not a case. Because I know that the Canadian troops didn't go to Afghanistan to kill Afghans. So you need to take a look at these things from from all sides. And we can make a case about everything. And so I think that this is where President Karzai has gone wrong. He's right that nobody should go into an Afghan home in the middle of the night and then, start shooting. He's absolutely right. No one has the right to go and kill an Afghan civilian, I don't care who they are, for no reason whatsoever. But we also saw that they brought the guy back and they prosecuted him and they gave him a life sentence. So if a Canadian soldier has gone into an Afghan home and killed someone for no reason whatsoever, in cold blood, it's the Canadian government's job and responsibility to bring him back and prosecute him here. Because I will not give him, I will not accept injustice in that case as well. And I don't think any Canadian would either.
We'll go to the monitor. The question is from Michelle in Ottawa. You mentioned social media's potential role in Afghanistan's future. Can you comment on its role during the 13-year engagement? And I think that 13-year is referring to...
Very good. It's a good question. Social media is somewhat of a new phenomenon. It's probably 4 or 5 years old. And so during the first phase of developing and building infrastructure for internet and high, new technologies, it took a while for the Afghans to even hook up to a satellite system or even have electricity. I mean, I remember the first 3-4 years that I spent in Kabul, even at the foreign ministry, we spent so much time with no electricity whatsoever, summer or winter, and had to deal with that. Only in the past 5 or 6 years have we been able to build the grids and connect Afghanistan and import power and generate power domestically. And so that has spurred the internet revolution, and that has spurred the new social media tools that are being used. But it is growing very fast. It's one of the fastest growing sectors of the Afghan economy as well as Afghan social trends.
Do we have time for one more question, Mr. Moderator? All right, this gentleman over here.
Shall we take one more also from there or not?
Yeah, we'll take them in sequence. Okay. So if you could pose your question, sir, if you could pose your question, and then I'll let you respond.
Ron Matthews, Waterloo. My question has to do with the prospects of security and peace going forward. When I was in Afghanistan last month, working with NGOs and university students, I was hearing a lot about a critique of the West's discussion and even President Karzai's discussion about bringing the Taliban to the table, when their concern was much more about all the armed opposition groups. You've made passing reference to that, but mainly talking about the Taliban. Would you make comment about the other armed opposition groups?
And this gentleman here.
Sure, Habib from Kitchener-Waterloo. First of all, thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion. Mrs. Samad, you always make complex things very simple, and certainly useful to a lot of us who really don't know the history of Afghanistan that much. 2 questions. I hear that currently, if you walk into Kabul, it's become a very cosmopolitan city. So you see Filipinos, you see Malaysians, you see Indians there, you see a number of people from the Eastern European countries as well. Now, in your discussion, you talked a lot about the West, North Americans' relationship and all that. So my first question was, what about the other countries in the East which are closer to Afghanistan that have much more impact in terms of improving the quality of life of the Afghanis? What is their contribution? How are they making out? And at what level are they working with the Afghan population to transform the culture and the mindset and the behavior of the Afghani population to bring them along with what's happening in the rest of the world? So that's number one question. The second question was that you obviously have a lot of non-state people working in Afghanistan, whether they are civil society organizations or a number of others. So can you shed some light in terms of what are they doing which is right and good and helpful, and what are the things that are not working? Because you probably have all kinds of civil society organizations there. What are some of the organizations doing that is really not beneficial to the country? Thank you.
Thank you. In regards to initiatives towards armed groups, there are mainly two armed groups that are fighting the system, if you want to call it, or the establishment in Afghanistan. You have the Taliban, and the Taliban, we can discuss this in more detail, are made up of their own sort of subgroups. And then you have this other less powerful and less important group called the Hizb Islami, led by a warlord called Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And the armed faction of the Hizb Islami has also been involved in some attacks and in some armed operations. The government has dealt with the Hizb Islami in such a way that it has been broken up into several factions. And interestingly enough, some of these factions now are no longer involved in armed attacks, and they are part of the political setups, and some of their leaders are right now as members of electoral tickets. There are at least 3 former Hizb Islami leaders who are running as part of tickets, presidential tickets. The Taliban is a different story. It's a very complex story. It involves, as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan's role. It involves even, to some extent, Saudi Arabia. There was an attempt at opening an office for them in Qatar a year and a half ago, which failed miserably because they raised the flag and they put a name that sort of meant that they were an embassy, whereas they are not recognized as a state. And so that process was halted. And since then, there really hasn't been any attempt at meeting the Taliban. There have been ad hoc meetings and sort of controversial meetings between ex-Taliban or Taliban who have been ousted from the leadership council, but they are not considered as authoritative. So the Taliban track right now is cold, and it's not going anywhere. Does that answer your question? Okay. Sir, thank you for those questions. On, on the issue of others, and you're absolutely correct. I mean, I try to convey this sense that, there are almost 60 nations from across the world who are committed and engaged in Afghanistan. I mean, NATO itself It's NATO plus 10 other nations, including Mongolia, who have sent officers and troops to Afghanistan. Almost every country in Europe and Asia has had a role to play over the last 13 years in Afghanistan. All the Baltic states, for example, have sent troops to Afghanistan, some of whom have been involved in training, and or others have been involved in supporting the main contingents of other countries. On the non-military side, countries from the Middle East, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia to some extent, Qatar, have been involved in supporting projects in Afghanistan. India is a major donor in Afghanistan. China is a major donor. Japan is probably one of the largest donors to Afghanistan over the last 13 years. Countries such as Australia and New Zealand had a PRT in central Afghanistan, which they closed down just last year. So, I mean, this has been, as I mentioned, one of the largest multilateral undertakings since World War II, involving many countries. And this is why I mentioned to you that it would have been odd if everyone else had gone to Afghanistan and, let's say, the Canadians had decided at some point in 2004 or 5 that they were not going to get involved. But it was a sovereign decision. I mean, it's the Canadian Parliament and the Canadian government that decided that it was going to go and get engaged in Afghanistan. Whether it was tied to Iraq or not, or whether whether there were other political considerations is also an issue for Canadians to discuss. But Kabul Kabul for the past 13 years has become a very cosmopolitan city because of the presence of so many nationalities, both on the civilian side. The UN mission in Afghanistan is one of the largest in the world. Embassies that have opened up in Kabul are I mean, the US embassy is the largest embassy in the world. The UK embassy, I think, is one of the largest, so on and so forth. And countries in the region obviously have quite an interest in what is happening in Afghanistan. Turkey is a major, not only donor, but Turkey is also a major investor in Afghanistan. So is India, so is China. South Korea is a major donor to Afghanistan. So, I mean, I could go on and on about the involvement of other countries, both on the civilian side and on the military side. Germany has been for a long time a very important contributor to Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'd now like to invite Vice President Kuntz to deliver the benediction.
Well, a few thank yous are in order. First of all, I'd like to thank Fen, of course, for ably stimulating the discussion tonight, despite having been on his feet since the wee hours of last night due to some travel, so thank you for that, Fen. And then most especially, of course, to Ambassador Omar Samad for his remarks this evening. In answering the question on all of our minds, was it worth it? You demonstrated to us that it is a glass half full with many important signs of progress over the last 13 years in health and education and other areas. And you let us know that ordinary Afghans are indeed grateful for the sacrifices that Canadians have made in lives and in direct assistance. And I'm sure we're all glad to hear that. But you also pointed out that a lot more remains to be done. And so, like you, we'll be watching the April 5th elections closely and the events that unfold after that in the hopes of more progress. And as we watch those events unfold, we'll remember your insights, your remarks tonight, your deeply informed views, and your love for your country. Thank you for all of your remarks. I should just add a couple of quick notes, if I may. An edited video will be posted to the CG website, and we'll post a blog about this event where you can add your own comments. And I'd like to just quickly mention the next two events in this auditorium. On Tuesday, March 28th, we welcome Margaret S. McMillan of Tufts University, who will talk about Africa's Quiet Revolution. And on Wednesday, April 2nd, we present Jed Davis of the World Energy Council, who will explain global efforts to transform the way we think about energy and climate change, especially for the 2 billion people who lack access to clean and modern sources of energy. So register for those events in our newsletter, including the upcoming CG Cinema Series events, and thank you for coming to CG tonight. Have a safe journey home.